Oh, for crying out loud. This is absolutely unbelievable and utterly frustrating. What in the world just happened? I can't believe it.
Fuck! Without a peek. 5. Siren Ladak. Ira, they've broken into our house.
Mom, I'm going to... Mommy! About...
Fuck. Yes, I'll take it off. Just into the corridor, quickly, Ira. The substation was fucked, damn it.
Hello, fellow students. I am a representative of the Mead College. Here we are, sitting here. We're just surviving here somehow for now, little by little.
Near the globe, the air defense got hit.
It just exploded over there somewhere, fuck.
Lightning, friends, is hitting Moscow again.
Fuck, it flew sideways, straight the fuck over here.
The capital is shaking, air defense is working non-stop, the largest factory in Moscow is on fire. Students from Moscow universities are being sent to the basement, and there's an urgent evacuation underway in Zelenograd.
Hello, fellow students. I am a representative of the Might College. Here we are sitting here, we've gathered some stools. There are still people over there, they've already turned off the ventilation. Or maybe they've turned it on. We're just surviving here somehow for now, little by little.
So at the same time, there's an attack on Novorossiysk.
Damn, listen to it roar, guys.
Lara! What exactly is inside the wheel?
Lyra! Is here right now!
Our house got hit.
Mom, Mommy! Look!
Do you see the smoke?
Lara, we were shooting.
From right here! Holy cow, wow! Oh my goodness, look at that! Dad! It's not scary!
What the hell is wrong with you?
Fuck, seriously!
Get to the hallway, quick, Ira!
What am I seeing? Holy shit! Holy shit! Damn it,
More than 150 drones are simultaneously entering occupied Crimea. The peninsula is on fire. Power plants, oil refineries, and military bases are under attack. Sobyanin reports that they're shooting down drones with their bare hands.
But actually, though,
There's smoke and fire in the city. At a major Moscow enterprise, just recently the largest power plant near Moscow was attacked.
it is truly regrettable that they have caused such significant damage and disruption to the operational plant. This egregious error has led to severe consequences, impacting its functionality and overall efficiency, which is a truly frustrating and unacceptable outcome.
There are blackouts in the region already for the... Oh, is it about to blow up? There goes the black smoke. Are you serious? I hear gunfire. Or what is that? What is that? I'm getting out of here. Huh? All these strikes are already hitting the very life support system of Russia. And people near Moscow are sitting there without electricity, without heat. Russian thermal power plants, oil refineries, and key oil processing plants are coming under attack. This is what the Russian economy and the everyday stability of its people rely on.
I'm shocked and in tears.
These are no longer just local outages. This is the destruction of the basic infrastructure on which every Russian business and family depends. How are these strikes affecting the Russian economy and the lives of ordinary Russians? Let's discuss this right now with top economist Igor Lipsitz. Freeze, freeze, wolf's tail. Just recently, the largest substation near Moscow, the Shatura Gres, was attacked. The footage was phenomenal. In the Moscow region, they said these were temporary blackouts, emergency power cuts. This is already the third time. Then we attack again, tightening the ring around a series of substations near Moscow. So this is happening regularly, practically every 2 to 3 days. And during blackouts in Belgorod, Kursk, and Bryansk, people are reporting that in some regions there's not even any water. But this attack on the Shatura GRES was the most powerful one yet. How do you assess this overall, especially the reality of blackouts in the capital of Russia?
It's quite funny, I mentioned this a few months ago, that a blackout in Moscow was possible. Even before President Zelensky did, I said it. And it's really amusing that Russian mass media immediately started discussing this topic. And the main point was that there's no such thing as a blackout, that it's impossible in Moscow. There are a lot of backup capacities here. Everything will be redirected, everything will be repaired. A blackout in Moscow is impossible. The system has a huge safety margin. And to be honest, I didn't really believe that, because I lived through that blackout in Moscow in 2005. Moscow was without power for 2 days, and there was nothing pleasant about it. And now, it's very interesting to observe this using Shatura as an example. So in this sense, Shatura serves as a kind of testing ground. How capable is the Russian energy system of compensating for such lost capacities? Well, it's not very capable. So they weren't able to organize any significant transfer of electricity. They had to bring in mobile stations to somehow supply electricity to people's homes. They spent a long time connecting the hospital to alternative heating through an external thermal station. It took them about a day to connect it, I think. So Shatura is actually a small town. So if there are any serious attacks on Russian Moscow power plants, honestly, I really doubt how Moscow would be able to compensate for that. And there are a lot of these power plants. They are lined up along the MKAD and are very visible. So in this sense, it's not even the same kind of facility as Shatura. Shatura, well, what is really there? Just a small building and a chimney. Oh my God. If you look at how huge these Moscow power plants are, they're just made to be attacked over and over. So if all this happens, I really doubt that Moscow will be able to avoid a blackout. A blackout in Moscow would mean an almost immediate paralysis of the entire Russian banking system, and a paralysis of the financial sector, since everything goes through Moscow. All transactions go through Moscow, and suddenly it would turn out that it's basically impossible to pay salaries or make payments, and retail trade would stop functioning. In other words, a serious crisis would begin simply because all of Russia is tied to Moscow. Moscow is not just the capital, it's the main nerve center of the Russian Federation. It's a transportation hub, a banking hub, and a financial hub, since everything goes through the budget. That's why, if there is a blockade in Moscow, it would be an extremely severe catastrophe, not just a social disaster for Muscovites left without heat and electricity, with no clear idea of what to do with them in such a situation, but it would also be a blockade of almost the entire Russian economy. That's why this issue is extremely dangerous for Russia. And as for how ready Russia is to deal with this, I don't understand. Right now, the main, sort of theme among these Z correspondents is, damn, we thought there was an impenetrable ring around Moscow, but it was breached so easily. And honestly, it's frightening to watch. I also watched, just like in those videos, how this Ukrainian drone is flying, and they're firing at it with machine guns, but in general, they can't really hit it. Hey.
Yes, Igor Vladimirovich, I'm listening to you.
Something disappeared on my end.
Well, I can see you. Everything's fine.
All right. So they can hit it. In other words, in reality, the capabilities of Russian air defense to counter drones aren't actually that great. We've already seen them bringing out those anti-aircraft machine guns, setting them up near the Kremlin. Yeah, the image is unbelievable. So in this sense, if a serious, massive, combined attack begins on Russian thermal power plants in Moscow, then of course a blockade of Moscow is possible, and that would immediately be a major blow to the entire economy of the Russian Federation, to the whole country, since everything is centered around Moscow. Russia turned out to be unprepared for the kind of war that's happening now. Igor Vladimirovich.
Well, I see a huge number of remote regions in Russia saying that they have no water, that they have no electricity, that they're facing problems. They come out and complain, Vladimir Vladimirovich, so penitently, so submissively, with such a slave mentality, we have no electricity, we have no water, we have no heat. And I watch these videos, it's just unbelievable. And some people are even standing in line for food stamps. I saw this too. It was in the Far East, and they're standing there. It's snowing, it's cold, it's freezing, and they're waiting for food stamps. It was written that these food stamps, or rather ration cards, will also appear in the Moscow region. I don't understand what's going on.
No one understands either. We were living well, everything was fine, and suddenly there are some problems. It's not even clear why. There was some minor regional military operation, the special military operation, as you remember, not even a war, just a special military operation somewhere on the outskirts, And for some reason, suddenly all these problems appeared. How does that happen? The war didn't end quickly, it's been going on for 4 years. It's already almost like the Great Patriotic War, and it doesn't really smell like victory, does it? The troops aren't approaching Berlin, are they? And there aren't any battles on the outskirts of Kiev, fortunately, right? So basically, after 4 years of a very exhausting war, Russia's economy is already heavily damaged. Russians are desperately denying this in every way. They each write letters saying they have no heat, no water, and that it all seems like a disaster. But overall, they all claim, no, everything is fine with us. We're ready to endure. We're not suffering at all. Everything is good. Well, and accordingly, their behavior will determine their fate. They will experience all these hardships in full. The economy is indeed already extremely exhausted and destroyed. And right now, we are witnessing a truly fantastic process of adopting budgets for the coming year. These budgets are fake from the very start. In other words, they are unfeasible, but they are all being adopted with some absolutely unbelievable figures. That is, the budgets are already in deficit now, revenues are falling right now, yet they are adopting budgets for the entire territory of Russia for next year, with a projected revenue growth of 20 to 25% next year. In other words, the governors have been tasked with adopting the most optimistic budgets possible so they can tell the public how next year you will prosper, live in luxury, and have a wonderful life. These are all absolutely fantastical figures, bogus documents. They will not and cannot be fulfilled in any way. The financial trouble is extremely severe, but they are already starting to conceal it, even at the stage of adopting budgets for the coming year.
In Yakutia, payments to Ukraine war participants have been temporarily suspended, and bloggers write that up to 100,000 Russians died for Pokrovsk Bakhmut.
Well, look, so they're not giving out payments, and now Russian complaints have already started. It's beginning. There are already videos appearing where people speak out and say they're not paying the death benefits. So a person died, and when he signed the contract, it was promised that in the event of his death, the federal budget would pay 100,000 for the funeral, but 100,000 for a funeral in Russia today is absolutely nothing. You need about 400,000 to 500,000 just to be able to bury someone at all. And it was promised that regional budgets would provide up to 1 million, and people signed contracts under these conditions. But the obligations of the regions have no legal force. They are not supported by any legislative or lawmaking activity. So now basically the regions are saying, no, we don't have any money. We won't give you any million. Deal with it however you can. This is a typical story. People going to war are promised mountains of gold and rivers of wine, but then when they die or return disabled, they get nothing. This is a standard situation. Russia has always been a country that deceives its veterans. It has always been this way. And there's nothing new about this. I remember it well from the story with the Afghan veterans who were sent there, and it was a terrible story. They weren't recognized as combat veterans. They didn't receive any. It was said that there were no combat operations in Afghanistan. It was called friendly assistance to the friendly regime of Afghanistan. There was no war there, so you can't get any certificate as a war participant. You can't get any benefits. And for years, they fought to be recognized as combat veterans and to receive at least some benefits. In this sense, they have no illusions about the Russian government or Russian authorities. They will definitely be deceived, definitely be betrayed, and the war participants will definitely be robbed. That's why we're already seeing that many regions, first of all, are cutting payments, stopping funeral payouts, and it's hard to say what will happen next, but it won't get any better because the budgets have no money. Most regions of Russia now have budget deficits, and this, well, is only growing. As far as I understand, let's say the budget deficit of the city of Moscow. Moscow was approved for this year at approximately $500 billion, and now, as far as I heard, it is already more than 800 billion. Deficit? This is Moscow, which, as everyone thinks, is bursting with money. It has a deficit, the budget is quite large, and the same is true for other regions. Therefore, of course, they will try to buy people, but there is no money to buy people. There are probably people. In Russia, as the war has shown, there is this terrifying issue. When I voiced it, I even felt a bit scared, but then my colleagues supported me and I stopped feeling embarrassed. It turned out that in Russia, there is a huge number of surplus people who are not needed by anyone. A huge number of men who are not needed by anyone, not by the economy, not by children, not by families, not by wives. Basically, they don't even need themselves. They sign a contract, leave, and die. That's why those Z-Cups, the war correspondents, can wave their hands around as much as they want. But this huge mass of men in Russia is not needed by anyone. They have no prospects in life, and they don't really have a life either. They go and enlist to kill Ukrainians. So it turns out that Russia is a country of mass murderers. This is the picture. This is what the war has revealed. a terrifying definition. But as you can see, hundreds of thousands of people have signed contracts for the right to become hired killers. Well, that's just the way things are.
I've put together a mixed bag of news for you, news that Russia has earned. So listen up just so you can reflect on it later. The Rostov region wants to introduce gasoline sales by passport. Gazprom is selling the refinery in Salavat to cover its losses. It's a nightmare over there. Half of small businesses in Russia could shut down because of rising taxes. The savings of Russians have reached an 8-year low.
Dasha, as you may know, I have a channel on Telegram. For me, that channel, I call it the Chronicle of a Declared Suicide. That's exactly how I run it. And I also have a genre there called Just Headlines. Sometimes I only publish press headlines because even commenting on them is impossible. Well, there are just so many crazy, frightening events happening in Russia because the country is kind of falling apart in different places and all sorts of insane stories are emerging and they can't be resolved because in Russia there's no logic of development, no ideology, no strategy. It is governed randomly. Everyone is pulling in different directions. The fabric of Russian life is tearing because of this. Here and there, holes keep appearing. I always say that Russian life now resembles a fire in a peat bog. The fire underground is the war, and it breaks through now in one place, now in another. And you never know where it will break through, whether it might break out right beneath you. And you could fall into a fiery abyss. It's all a terrifying story. That is, Putin set this peat bog of war on fire, and Russia is burning, and now it's impossible to stop it. In any way, you can't put out a burning peat bog. The only way to prevent it is to flood the peat bog completely with water again to turn it into a swamp. But you can't put out Russia like that. There are already so many fires burning that the entire economy would have to be rebuilt, and there is no money for that. Once again, we discussed the drop in oil prices, and oil was the source of all the money for saving and developing Russia. If that money isn't there, then there's simply no way to fix Russia, even if the war stops. There is no money for that today.
Now it's time to discuss the plan of Trump, Witkoff, and Kirill Dmitriev.
The plan is extremely cynical and brazen. Essentially, the US is selling out Ukraine and Russia for $200 billion. So Putin gives up his frozen $200 billion out of $350, which he would have had a hard time ever getting back anyway. He sells them. The Americans will manage these funds, some not entirely clear funds, in some unclear way, will be in charge of these monies. How exactly they will allocate money to Ukraine is unknown, but it's more or less clear who will be managing these funds, apparently some members of Trump's family. And then, well, the picture is simple. These funds will generate income, half of which will remain in the US, and some portion of that will go to members of Trump's family for managing these funds. That's why Trump is, in general, so nervous about any kind of resistance to this process. He has set up a nice family mechanism for generating income based on Russian money at Ukraine's expense, and now Ukraine is somehow interfering, behaving in a way that's not to his liking. It's simply outrageous.
The European partners are somewhat shocked. Boris Johnson even called it military castration. If I'm not mistaken, there's also economic castration going on there. I'd like you to comment on that.
Well, you see, European politicians are capable of saying beautiful words. And they probably are saying them right now. But the question is, are they actually ready to offer any real alternatives? Because with Trump, you can say, we're not going to help at all. We're not going to provide weapons. We're not going to sell weapons to Europe for Ukraine. And what will you do without us? You'll be lost. So the question is, if Europe somehow manages to solve the problem of economic and military support for Ukraine without the help of the US, then they can drop this prank, reject it, and gracefully get out of this situation without losing face. But the only question is, how capable are they of doing that? That I don't know. And you don't know that either. Maybe they themselves don't even know. But I'm afraid they're not really capable of it. But how should I put it? Europe's economic machine is enormous, but when it comes to translating that into military terms, it all looks rather awkward. And this war has shown just how rotten Europe is, militarily speaking. For me, that's also, something of a shock. There was this idea that after all NATO has existed for so many decades, that something must have been done, prepared, so that in case of anything, they would somehow. But it turns out that if a war breaks out, it would take them either 24 or 40 days to move troops from the English Channel to the conflict zone. That's an unbelievable number. You could walk across Europe in that amount of time. And it would take them that many days to move troops only because in some places the rail gauges are different and in others the bridges are in terribly poor condition. So it's just a nightmare when it turns out that the NATO military machine, the North Atlantic Bloc, is a complete sham, an utterly useless system. When it turns out that European military units can't coordinate with each other, they don't have unified protocols, and all this talk about NATO rapid response forces, supposedly able to deploy quickly if needed, also turns out to be questionable. So, in short, it became clear that from a military standpoint, the European potential hasn't amounted to anything real. And the military industry is weak and develops slowly, and they're only planning to get something done by around 2030. By that time, you could die twice, 3 times, even 4 times over. So, unfortunately, the situation is such that the US has a powerful military industry, it has arsenals, it has weapons, but as for what Europe has, it's hard to say. That's why it's hard for us to believe in their capabilities. They're always explaining that they don't have any ammunition, no missiles, they need everything for themselves, and that's why they can't supply anything. So there's this enormous economic power, but it was never directed toward the military sphere at all. Europe became very complacent. They believed that the US would handle all the issues of protecting them from the Soviet and later Russian threat, so they did nothing themselves. Now they're trying, but it's still rather slow, sluggish, and not very impressive. So imagining that they'll suddenly say, forget about the US, we'll take on all the military supplies and economic support for Ukraine ourselves and actually do it, I just don't see it happening yet. They're not succeeding at that. So what arguments do they have then? As Trump says, you don't have any cards. Putin has cards. He's ready to give up the rights to his frozen foreign exchange reserves. Those are cards. And what cards does Europe have? Honestly, I don't really know. So for now, the situation doesn't look very cheerful.
A contentious point is the joint projects between the US and Russia. We perfectly understand that the only thing Trump cares about in this life is money and lots of it. And that in principle is his main priority, his yardstick. So what do joint US-Russia projects actually mean? What kinds of projects could these be after the war ends? And is there any element of corruption here, nepotism, a family clan? Because I noticed that this plan was actually written by Kushner, and he's someone close to Trump, his son-in-law. And Dmitriev, please, the floor is yours.
Trump and Kushner are not just close associates, they're not just relatives. You have to keep in mind that Kushner is practically Trump's shadow cardinal. So if you look into it, it was actually Kushner who organized Trump's election. He acted as a sort of shadow leader of his campaign headquarters and set everything up. So, in fact, Trump's entire victory was achieved through Kushner's efforts. That's why it's extremely important. He's not just a relative or son-in-law, this is a very serious matter. And it's clear that basically all of it, so practically speaking, from the 350 billion of frozen Russian funds, 3 funds are being formed. One of them is formally purely American, from which 50% of the income goes to the USA, though it's unclear for what reason. Then there are 100 billion, it's not clear how, but apparently also in America. And 150 billion, these are specifically Russian American. Apparently all of them will be managed by Kushner in one way or another. And accordingly, the income from this will largely go to the Trump family, as I said. So here, of course, the story is basically that Russia gives its foreign reserves to the Americans, but in exchange for this money, it essentially buys Ukraine in the form that suits it. This is exactly the kind of cynical, disgusting picture we're dealing with, utterly so. But the question of whether the European Union will be able to prevent this vile turn of events remains open for me, and I don't know if they can or not. At the moment, I don't really believe they can. So there are really 2 forces at play here. The Americans, who are ready to take this money and in exchange give up Ukraine, and Russia, which is willing to sacrifice this money in order to get what it wants regarding Ukraine. And then there are the Europeans who don't really have any cards to play except for pretty words about not abandoning Ukraine and not being able to allow such a thing to happen. Whether they will actually be allowed to participate in this in any real way is still unclear. Maybe they'll be given a chance, or maybe not. As you know, the US attitude toward the European Union is extremely negative. Just look at Vance's speech. He said everything that needed to be said. Pay attention to how that American general was swearing at the European representatives during the recent negotiations. The attitude is like, well, what are they to us? There's a pack of little mutts running around, yapping and barking, but they have no strength. Their teeth are tiny. Why pay attention to them? Let them bark. But we will make a serious deal with Russia. For this money, we'll give Ukraine to Russia in whatever form Russia is ready to accept it. Everything's fine.
A meeting between Zelensky and Trump could take place as early as this week. Peskov immediately responds, "We haven't received any information at all about negotiations involving the US, Ukraine, and European countries in Geneva. We don't understand anything, we don't know anything, whatever they say."
Well, I repeat, if they see that the options suit them and they get what they want for their money, they will sign these agreements. If the terms they wanted are changed, they'll say they're not ready for that at all, and the war will continue as it has so far. The picture is clear, so all these maneuvers by the Europeans are probably good, useful, and desirable for Ukraine, but will they lead to something ideal? Will some document be signed and the fighting stop? I can't say for now, and you don't know either.
Igor Vladimirovich, regarding this statement, in fact, in the first 28 points, it was mentioned that Russia is coming out of international isolation. There was a point about amnesty, and also that Russia is returning to the G8. I would like you to comment on this.
Well, Russia wants to come out of this as if nothing happened. So, as you can see, there are basically no points about reparations. There's nothing like that. There's no statement that these are war criminals who should somehow be punished. Russia wants to come out of this clean, to come out of the war unscathed, to emerge from its crimes as if innocent, as if nothing happened. That's the story here, and it's understandable. And they believe that for their money, they should get all of this. They're paying a good price, and apparently Trump has accepted that price. That's why right now they're brazenly demanding that everyone just forget what they did on Ukrainian territory. They paid 350 billion, so forget about it, and that's it. But of course, even so, it still won't work out for them in full, because it's clear that under no circumstances will the US hand over the European energy market to Russia. Not under any conditions. They didn't seize control of that market just to give it back to Russia later, so Russia still won't get the European market. And without that, lifting the sanctions won't really strengthen the Russian economy much.
In your opinion, does this mean that the negotiation process will reach a dead end again? Because Ukraine will change these 28 points in order to benefit himself, and Russia will simply not accept all of this.
Essentially, the issue is that if Trump doesn't get his money, he'll say, I've done everything I could. I'm washing my hands of this. There will be no aid. We won't supply weapons. Let these two countries, Russia and Ukraine, fight with what they have, and eventually, when they're exhausted, they'll sign negotiation documents and the war will end. Trump keeps saying that we're here to save human lives. And you're trying to kill as many people as possible. This is madness. That's how he sees the situation. Right now, he senses a direct personal financial interest in this contract, this deal, this agreement, in managing these funds and the income that will come from it. And you're trying to take money away from him personally, from his family. And what are you offering him in return? Does Ukraine have anything to offer in return? Nothing. That's why he keeps saying that Zelensky has a weak hand, that you can't offer me a bribe. Well, let's call it that. Trump is easy to manage and control when he's given a personal bribe. Well, like when she came to Switzerland, she brought a gold bar, brought a Rolex gold watch, put it on the table in the Oval Office, promised some investments, and as a result, there was a significant reduction in tariffs. That's how you have to work with Trump. He's a simple guy, as simple as they come. You bring the cash, you get the deal. You don't bring the cash, you get lost. That's about it. That's the language, that's Trump's mentality, and Ukraine has nothing to offer him. But Russia does. 350 billion is good money. Invested at 3%, you get 10 billion every year. Even if it's 10 billion and 2.5 go to Trump's family, that's something worth fighting for.
Igor Vladimirovich, so let's say in this situation with the fund, we understand what Trump wants, what his family wants. But how will Europe react? Because from what I've seen, European leaders were outraged specifically by this fund managing the frozen assets. They don't understand why 50% of the income, the profits, are planned to be given to the US.
Dasha, what role do they play in these negotiations? I mean, really think about it. What can they actually do? They can supply Russia, Ukraine, with a significant amount of weapons. No, the whole idea was that they would use Russian foreign exchange reserves and issue a reparations loan against those reserves, and with that money, buy weapons from the US to supply to Ukraine. That's the picture here. So they have no real trump cards. They don't have a massive military industry of their own. They don't have combat units that are prepared to go into Ukraine. They're not ready to close the skies over Ukraine. Europe isn't prepared to do any of that. All they have are pretty words saying, we're participating in these negotiations and no decision can be made without us, right? And then the US will say, all right, we're pulling out of this process. We'll even stop supplying weapons, solve the problem of Ukraine's defense on your own with European forces. So what results will we see? None at all. That's why, unfortunately, my outlook isn't very optimistic at the moment.
When talking with Republicans, for example, Boris Pingas, he believes that Congress will not allow this situation to happen, that it's impossible, and that Congress has a different point of view. So both Republicans and Democrats will put pressure on Trump within the United States. In other words, they won't allow intelligence data to stop being shared with Ukraine. And on top of that, American companies, especially arms manufacturers who want to make money, want Europe to buy weapons from them. That's impossible. What do you think about this point of view?
It's all empty talk. But they've already come out recently, you remember, right? No to the kings, they went out to protest. And what came of it, Dasha? Tell me, how did it end up? Did Trump change his policy? Did he change people? Nothing at all. There were no results. He only made a video where he dumped some kind of waste on them, if you remember, right? He expressed his attitude, and in general, these rallies had no influence whatsoever on his policy. We saw this ourselves. So people can go out as much as they want, say whatever they want. So far, we haven't seen any political consequences. So the situation is such that Trump is the commander in chief. If he orders it, there will be no deliveries. And military orders will be found elsewhere. Even Saudi Arabia will buy more. Now, Japan will be buying more weapons because the Americans apparently are encouraging Japan to start a conflict with China over Taiwan. So Japan is now going to buy a lot of additional American weapons. So in this sense, the American military-industrial complex won't be left out in the cold. But if they stop supplying Ukraine, well, that will be a huge problem for Ukraine. But for the American military-industrial complex, that won't be a problem at all. Especially since, as you know, the American military-industrial complex has just secured a record US military budget of $1 trillion. So they're doing fine financially. They can get by without Ukraine.
Yesterday, I heard the opinion of an Americanist that if Trump's diplomatic track in the Russia-Ukraine war fails once again, he'll need an urgent, victorious, and swift war to rehabilitate himself on the international stage, and he might go after Venezuela.
It's possible. Look, we're witnessing an interesting situation. Without any announcements or legal grounds, the US Air Force started blocking the Venezuelan coast, and they let in Russian tanks. The US quietly and calmly, without any loud statements, imposed a naval blockade on Venezuela. No difficulties at all. They basically began military actions against Venezuela in the purest sense. A blockade preventing ships from entering the country's ports. This blockade is an act of war. In other words, the US has essentially started military action against Venezuela. Obviously, Venezuela can't resist. And for the US, there's a big advantage in this. Venezuela is the richest country in the world in terms of oil. It's all clear because US refineries are well set up for Venezuelan oil. That's why these oil supplies will basically go straight to familiar domestic refineries. Everything will be just fine. It's not that US demand will be met by Venezuelan oil, rather, American oil will be happily sold to India, China, and Europe, and everything will be fine. And the war will be a good one, close by, and will be justified under the pretext of fighting drug cartels and who knows what else. Well, that's all quite possible.
Friends, please support our content. Igor Lipschitz, Igor Vladimirovich, thank you, and I hope to see you again soon.
All the best. Take care.